Greetings, everybody. I hope you're all doing okay. This is part 3 of personality theories and assessment. So we'll take another look at what can be a very interesting subject. So I've stuffed a lot of other charts, that I found from various other sources, and I've been using kind of gone back to Griggs a little bit, that textbook, and I did upload. I did find a PDF file of the entire third edition of the book. So I've uploaded that. Not that you have to read that. You stay with the NOBA text and the aside readings, but just another resource for you, going forward. It's always interesting maybe to look up, all things psychology from Griggs. But I have switched back somewhat to Griggs as far as the PowerPoint. So that's what I'm using here for this one. And I believe the next 2 or 3 videos after this, we'll be looking at social psychology and things of that nature from Griggs also. It's just a little bit more in-depth content. And then I'm adding to that some other charts as well into the PowerPoint that the publisher provides. So as you see, self-perception, and it says part 1, not because the entire topic today is on self-perception, but it's just a series of slides here. So we want to talk about self-perception a little bit. Maybe we ought to just talk about perception for a moment, and then we'll add the self to it. So when you think of perception or to perceive, how do you perceive something? Or you might question someone else's perception. I wonder how they're perceiving this. Have you ever, taken a step back and thought, well, what is it that I really mean by that? Now we have to go back to cross-cultural communication a little bit and unpack some of this communication loop. Not a whole lot, but just saying perception. How I would take it to mean how do you see things? To perceive is to see. But not just physical sight. So you observe something, but then there's a correlation between physical sight and mental insight. I hope that makes sense. And so you're reflecting, you're thinking, you take it in. Now, there's a lot of things, physical sight wise, that we take in during the day, and most of it is forgotten. And we'd have to go back to that whole chapter on memory. Is it really forgotten, or is it just there to be called up at some point? Regardless, how much of that really comes into your conscious mind for reflection? Perhaps if somebody questioned you later in the day and said, "Do you remember? You were in the dining hall earlier, right? You were there. Do you remember over on the left-hand side seeing this display set up or something, like that?" Then you might think about it and think, "Huh, yeah, I did," or I really can't recall. But perception is more immediate. Perception is I'm seeing something, I'm taking it in, I'm observing, and I'm using all of my mental energy to come to some type of conclusion or evaluation. All of that is how you perceive something. Now, we generally will say, or it's a common colloquialism, there's a college word for it. It's common thing for somebody to say is this, perception is reality. How you see it is basically how you determine the truth and what's real and so on and so forth. So perception, when you add the idea of self to that, now it's not just, well, I observe a car accident, I observe a storm. Well, these are all too negative. I observe people, a group having fun at a gathering, a party or something. There's something positive. How do you perceive that? You perceive it. So self-perception then turns internal. It's yourself. How do you perceive yourself? I might say it's the me that I think I am. And earlier on, we talked about some of the Freudian stuff about the conflict. Really between kind of the conscious self and then the ideal self and, all this kind of thing. But who is it that you believe yourself to be? That's self-perception. and everyone has it. So there can be a tension between how others perceive you, and you can get very, very defensive. That's not me. That's not what I'm about. I'm not that way. Maybe we are. Maybe we are. And we need others to sort of do the observing. How fair are we? And so I think sometimes we get defensive because of the issue of persona, not self-perception. And so persona is kind of the me that I want you to think that I am. And really, this is kind of foolish, because we should be Christ-centered, Bible-based, Spirit-filled believers. And so really, when we look at the body of Christ and we see the fruit of the Spirit, these are the things that should be dominant in our life. This should really overcome any of the sort of negative aspects of our character and our personality and things like that. So that's all wonderful in a spiritual formation class, to be sure. But a persona is sort of like the image you're trying to sell. You're trying to sell others this image that you could be a person that's kind of timid and shaky. And you remember, I'm a self-professed introvert. My wife vehemently disagrees with that. So there's my self-perception. But then my wife, who knows me probably better than I know myself, will say you're really not that way at all. But you can then try to put a persona out there. If you're at a job interview and it's not deception per se, I guess. What you're trying to do is to present yourself as being strong and assertive and demonstrative about your duties, so to give that employer the impression of who you believe yourself to be. And you may not be an outgoing, individual, but you are somebody who's attentive to your work, and you certainly don't want to walk into an interview situation and present yourself to be, this kind of quiet, timid person, and the employer might get the idea that you're not at all faithful about your duties and things. So there's this persona, the me that I want others to think that I am, and then there's self-perception. It's the me that I think I am. And that's kind of where we're starting here. It's this idea about self-perception. And we have these words: attribution, internal attribution, external attribution. So attribution in general, how we explain our own behavior and that of others. To whom do we attribute this quality that we have, or something that's happened around us, something like that? So you get the internal, which is attributed to us, and an external, an outcome that's attributed to factors outside the person. Sounds all technical and everything. If we look at, for example, this little chart, who did it? Who did it? Well, it's either me or someone else. So let's just narrow this right down to its most simple terms, right? So we want to know who did it. To whom are we going to attribute that, whatever happened? And so we might say, in terms of self-perception, we might say, well, that depends on the outcome. If it's a good thing, I'm going to take credit for it. If it's a bad thing, I'm going to lay it off on somebody else, which is somewhat, in essence, where we're going with this a little bit. So if you look, if it's a positive outcome, then who did it? In terms of, we're gonna lay it off on personality. We're gonna say, well, it's my internal attribution. It's something about my personality. It's something about my character. It's some endearing quality, some merit, something that I have to bring to the table. However, if it's someone else, then we're going to say, I'm not implying that we would do that, but I said this is just to go with the attribution kind of theory of self-perception. that oftentimes, and if it's a positive outcome, and it doesn't involve us, it involves someone else, then we could easily say, well, it's just the circumstances. It was the circumstances, that it's not so much the person, but they wouldn't have been able to do that without these other things happening. However, if it's negative, do you see how it's reversed in the table? If it's negative, something bad happened. It's the circumstances. It was too hot, it was too cold, it was too wet, or it was too dry, it was too soon, it was too late, it was something. It's the circumstances. But if it's someone else, well, it's because they're an angry person, they're a liar. They this. It's something attributed to their character. Yeah. So that's the idea of attribution, right? So much for some little bit of attribution. Now, how about this self-serving bias, which is a little bit of what we're talking about? Self-serving bias, a tendency to make attributions so that one can perceive oneself favorably, or adaptive because it protects one from falling prey to learned helplessness and depression. So we want to look at learned helplessness and depression. Remember, previously we talked about all those defense mechanisms, and we put a chart up there, and the head just rose and rose and rose. We talked about a few in particular, but then these are all the things that we speaking of self-perception, that we might tell ourselves to insulate us. I tell you guys, it's just one of the endearing things about being married, and for me, 40 years, and I've known Sally 47 years, is this sense of having someone objective beside yourself who knows you through and through, so that it's not just all self-perception. This is a beauty of marriage. The two become one, and you have this sense of not so much of one person owning the self-perception, but you have this self-serving bias. So is it adaptive? We talk about positive outcomes, negative outcomes. Is it adaptive because it's a defense mechanism? I just adapt it. So if the outcome is positive and an internal attribution for it is made, it's positive. I always knew I had it in me. I always knew I had this quality or something. If it's negative, then an external. Well, who can blame me because of that, because of those external circumstances? So let's look at this. So here's a little, napkin. Paper's in such rare. It's a wonder I could get this. You can't find paper products anymore. Anyway, so the result, just like the previous slide, if it's good, we take credit for it. If it's bad, we blame others. And so let's just put this, it's self-perception, it's the self-serving bias, but it's also a defense mechanism. I don't know, someone who's insecure, somebody who suffers from low self-esteem, then is going to want to take credit for what's, and it's going to, when somebody else takes credit for something that they did, they're going to get quite upset about it. But how about when something bad happens and we blame others? And I'm just suggesting these are default defense. Well, call them whatever you want, but just see, does this ring true as far as your experience of human nature? Wow, human nature. That's a loaded gun, isn't it? We mentioned earlier learned helplessness and depression. So we have it here, bold and colored in front of us. Causes, internal attributions for negative outcomes. Okay, so has to do with me then, because it's internal. Me, I failed the test because I'm no good. Maybe just I'm no good, period. I'm no good at math. Wow, there you go. External attributions for positive outcomes, right? So you aced the test. Well, that's because it was so easy. Something, has to do with the test. Easy. Pessimistic. So these are, you have your causes, then you have your pessimistic explanations. Now here's two words that are interesting. Stable, but it's going to be used here in a different way, maybe, than what you're used to. Like if you're used to kind of like a stable in terms of laboratory experiment or, 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 So it's sort of along the same lines, but look at the word always in there. I will always have no ability for math. You've concluded this is a dangerous place to be, by the way, especially if you're ever in a position where you're counseling people and you just hear that this is the way God made me. I can't change. That it tends. I can remember a professor telling me, 100 years ago, back when we were, chiseling out our notes on slabs of stone. It was a little heavy to carry around too. Now, he said that you couldn't change a man after 50. Maybe he didn't say it that pointedly, but I think he made so it's very difficult to change a person after 50. Maybe that's true. But I find that the Spirit of God isn't too concerned with our age and progress in life. He can overcome about every obstacle, right? Stable is a very pessimistic way to live. This idea. Now normally, you want everything stable. You just want everything stable. You want to make sure, it doesn't change. Everything's sort of under control. But in this case, if you have some negative behavior, instead of just laying it off on, I can't, that's just too hard. I can't, it doesn't, if that's your default, then you're going to default to pessimism, which, if you see learned helplessness, right? Learned helplessness. Oh no, here's this again. I'm helpless, or depression. And the more you yield to, it will always be this way, I will always be this way, you are teaching yourself how to be pessimistic. Wow. We could have a course on pessimism, and so every day you come into class and we all just stand up there. Hi, my name is, and I can't do that. Hi, my name is, I can't, right? It sounds silly, but if you really look in your own life and say, what is it that I really think imposes such an obstacle to me that I feel powerless and helpless? I'm sure you'll find some. So I'm not being critical of you, critical of me. I'm just saying I'm sure you'll find some. But what we want to be careful of is, are we learning? Are we actually teaching ourselves? And we can teach ourselves how to be depressed. We could offer another course on pessimism as a prerequisite to, and I'm being stupid now, I know, but I'm just saying we could make it as a prerequisite to our course on depression, right? Wow. And yet we do that. We don't even have tuition. We just teach ourselves. We open up our own school. So you have two things: stable and global. I'll always have no, and then I have no. Whoops, I'm covering that over. I have no ability for anything, is what that says without my picture over the top of it. I have no ability for anything. So stable and global. Stable kind of refers to one thing. A global is like, I use this in a global way, encompassing, my whole life. So a Seligman, or Martin Seligman, I'm going to throw this in there. It's not really in our our notes. I guess I'm trying to publish your notes. That's what I'm struggling to find. My brain isn't working today, if it ever does. Martin Seligman, his description on how explanatory style can lead to depression, how you explain what happens to you, in other words. Explanatory style, what is that? How you explain yourself, right? So internal and external. It's because of something about me. That's internal. Global, everything in my life is a failure. Wow. Oof, that's brutal. That's a brutal assessment of your life. If that's where you are, then it could be that some are. To be honest, guys, I look at this, and in my mind are the people, that are dead in the eyes, walking the streets. We see them every day, and it just tears my heart apart. The utter hopelessness and powerlessness that they feel, and I'm sure you see this and feel this the same way. Stable, it will always be like this, right? And then the external, it's because of something about the situation. Always laying it off on external attribution, something about the circumstances. Specific, I failed at this, but I can do other things. Things will get better. So when you have this IGS, or internal global unstable, it's more likely to lead to depression. But when you switch from it's because of something about me to it's something about the situation. Now, I'm not saying I buy all of this, because I can think of some really significant exceptions to this. Maybe there are some situations where Seligman has observed and identified a pattern of behavior and come to these rather generalized conclusions. I failed at this, but I can do other things. How about I failed at this, but I'm going to master it. How about that one? Or things will get better. Things might not get better. There are some situations they might not get better, but that doesn't mean you can't cope. So hey, we could get Seligman in the room and have an interesting discussion. So it could be something about me, but that doesn't mean that it leads to depression, right? I mean, the first thing to do is acknowledge, hey, this is a personal character flaw, and that's why I failed in this situation. All right, it's enough of Seligman. Goodbye, Mr. Seligman. How about learned helplessness? Isn't it fun just to grab stuff, and look at it and just at its face analyze it? So what about learned helplessness? Are we teaching ourselves this? Uncontrollable bad habits lead to a perceived lack of control, lead to generalized helpless behavior. So learned helplessness is this passive resignation produced by repeated exposure to negative events that are perceived to be unavoidable. We can't change the course of negative events. Failure is inevitable and insurmountable. So learned helplessness is about responses to failure, not to success. And there may be a whole nother, learned, what would that be like? Learned narcissism would be a wrong approach to a delusion of grandeur. Narcissistic tendencies have to do with an inappropriate correlation between oneself and some success. Or learned helplessness, a control problem, not a competence problem. So anyway, these are just patterns of responses by which you can begin to dig a hole of pessimism where, let's say it's a shallow hole that you're digging, but after a while it becomes a grave you can't climb out of, or depression, where you actually need someone to come along and to help you at some point. All right, so we want to shift now to assessment. So personality, we're still on personality, but a little bit about trait theories of personality and personality assessment. So we see personality traits on one side, trait theories on the other. I think certain traits, or the trait theories are that you can bundle. A personality is a bundle of or a composite of various traits. So internally based, relatively stable characteristics that define an individual's personality, whether they're open to others, whether they're socially outgoing, their mood and these types of things, whether they're reflective and introverted, whether they're extroverted. So it contains a dimension, a continuum ranging from one extreme of the dimension to the other. So let's say you had a cluster of all of these traits or characteristics. What we're suggesting there is that continuum. So remember when we drew circles on the whiteboard, and then up top we called it a semantic domain, and we had some fun, packing in all of the words that we felt described or defined that particular term. Well, now we switch from that to the continuum. And we've been playing with that a little bit in this series of lectures. So you have these two polarities, but in this case, not putting two different traits, one on one side, one on the other, which you could also do with a continuum. But in this case, if you had reflective, like this introversion or reflective. So let's say the continuum just represented a reflective type of trait or characteristic that goes along with that personality. So what we're saying is that the continuum represents a range. So in the middle would be a median range. Your stereotypical textbook dictionary definition of what it is to be reflective. But then there would be like those that are less, or minimal reflective, the minimal requirements to be reflective, and then those that are just crazy reflective, so let's just say someone is the medium point of reflection. So, from time to time, you're going to step back and you're going to think and ponder, wonder if I handled that well. And then what would be over here would be like, I wonder if I handled that well. Yeah, I guess I did. So there's minimal reflection. In the middle, you're going to really, think about it and give it some honest thought. Over here, you're going to be like this obsessive, compulsive person that can't let it go. Something happened, and instead of just giving it some thought and reflecting about it and moving on, it's like a ball and chain that, that you drag with you throughout the day or maybe throughout your life. Wow. So personality traits, just remember the continuum, and there can be a whole bunch of those things. And trait theories, they use factor analysis and other statistical techniques. Factor analysis identifies clusters of test items. In other words, how many factors, how many of these traits are in this cluster, to tell them how many basic personality factors are needed to describe human personality and the factors themselves, and then to identify clusters of test items on a personality test. So if you want to use trait theory in terms of determining in a personality assessment, then in order to test for those, you'd have to know what exactly we're going to put on a test to determine if that person has it. It's sort of like personality inventory or some of these spiritual gift tests, if you've ever taken those before. And if you answer all these questions just this way, it indicates that maybe you're more of a servant, you're more of a leader, and various other spiritual gifts. So we'll move on. The number and kind of personality traits. So Raymond Cattell used factor analysis that found that 16 traits were necessary to describe human personality. Get up to 16. Or Hans Eysenck used factor analysis and argued for three dimensions: biological assumptions. They're easy to test. And then some differences. Cattell and Eysenck differed because the number of traits depends on the level of categorization in the factor analysis. And then Eysenck's theory is at a more general and inclusive level of abstraction than Cattell's. So Eysenck's three-factor theory, he argued that these traits are determined by heredity. And so he lists them as extroversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism. Psychoticism, or psychotic, neurotic, and extrovert. Extroversion. So here's the continuum. The continuum, and you'd have, but this time you'd have extroversion and introversion, right? The two opposite poles or polarities on the two opposite extremes on the continuum. Neuroticism and emotional stability. Eroticism would be that obsessive kind of compulsive type of person, and over here, this more even-tempered, steady as you go, more mature individual. Psychoticism. Usually, a psychotic behavior is something that's impulsive and aggressive. And as far as people are concerned, there's interpersonal hostility that goes on. So you have the psychoticism on the one hand, all that impulsive aggressiveness, hostility, and a breakdown of interpersonal relationships. Over here is the impulse control, think it, don't say it, and maybe work on just not thinking it, but so you're over here and you're just more balanced, more mature, more in control of your own impulses. Then the biological basis for extroversion, introversion trait, level of cortical arousal. So in Eisenach's theory, he's talking about neuronal activity, the neurons and the neurotransmitters and all those things firing off, and the chemicals that create this type of reaction, within the brain. Extroverts need to seek out external stimulation. Now, this is on Eisenach, by the way. So we're just trying to observe and explain what Eisenach's theory is then. Extroverts need to seek out external stimulation to raise the level of arousal in the brain more to an optimal level. So he's suggesting that a person's biological makeup, that is to say, predetermines or pre-wires the individual to seek out this type of external stimulation. In other words, he's saying you're just wired that way, your personality. Personality is not something that is learned over time, but it's something that this is more how you are wired. It's more based in biology and genetics. Introverts, on the other hand, have higher normal levels of arousal than do extroverts, meaning they're far more sensitive individuals, perhaps. People who are high on the neuroticism, emotional stability dimension tend to be overly anxious, emotionally unstable, and easily upset because of a more reactive sympathetic nervous system. So, of course, he's linking this now to one's biological composition or makeup. The psychoticism impulse control trait is concerned with aggressiveness, impulsiveness, and empathy, on the other hand. So there's sort of this sense of acute, maybe acute sensitivity, which then on the positive side, on the one hand, on the good side, can give you this sense of a higher degree of empathy. But a high level of testosterone and a low level of MAO, which is a neurotransmitter inhibitor, lead to high levels of psychoticism. So this is far from a spiritual maybe description for behavior, but again, we're in this kind of humanistic camp here with many of these psychologists. So they're trying to, all they have to work with, they don't have a Bible in their hand. They don't have, they aren't taking into account the spiritual dimension. And I don't want to get too far flung with the spiritual, but that is the, let's maybe switch to biblical, the biblical description of the human being, and how that functions relative to God and an awareness of God and even a relationship with God, right? So they're just working with the raw human material as they see it. And of course, they have to default biologically to do that, because what else do you have besides neurotransmitters in the brain and all these kinds of things to justify or to give warrant for your conclusions? Because remember, with the humanists, everything is material and therefore has material causation, or if you prefer, natural and natural causation. So here's Hans Eisenach, and then we have 1916, 1997, his dates, the Penn model, and of personality. If you see the breakdown in the different shaded parts of the sphere, you have these continuums, but they're just up and down. Okay, they're more like quadrants than on a table. Unstable emotions, that's the neurotic towards the top. You have the stable emotions towards the bottom. You have the extroverted and the introverted. Now, then you have sort of this one a theory of personality where you'll say, well, there's the melancholy, the choleric, the phlegmatic, and the sanguine, and that those also are sort of trait based, and then you could some models using those four melancholy, choleric, phlegmatic, and sanguine will say that, well, you're not purely like 100% melancholy, but you might be 60% melancholy. And this is based on certain tests that are adapted to these particular traits. Okay, and so you might be a big M melancholy because you're 60%, and then you might be a small s sanguine, or phlegmatic and choleric, or phlegmatic, sanguine, those kinds of things. But you see that the types of traits, depending on which side of the continuum, passive versus sociable. And those certainly would be at different ends of a continuum, or quiet versus active, and so on. But this is just a model, and this is Eisnick. What about McCrae and Costa, a 5-factor model of personality? And that's all we're really dealing with here. Sort of trait theories, factor analysis, which is just how many traits in there, are we measuring, 15, 16? Are we measuring 3? Are those three inclusive of maybe the 16 if you reduce them down to more simplified categories? But their 5 factors include openness, and here's your OCEAN acronym here. Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, as though, okay, there you go. There are those 5. They appear to be universal. They are observed across gender and diverse languages and cultures, measured using several assessment instruments. And these are just different tests that are going to measure these prescribed traits. Okay, so when it says appear and observed, this is how it's based. So we study groups and populations of people that include a diversity of cultures, languages, gender, and so on, and we've come to the conclusion that these 5 things, if you go back here and you'll see 3, 4, 5, 6 on melancholy, or 6 on virtually all of these, right? And they mirror each other in this model. But this, they're saying, not an admixture of a bunch, but you're going to have openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism as being these, let's see, in the middle of this diagram, the traits. And then there, if you imagine that this is I don't know if you can see the cursor or not, me going back and forth like this. But that's the low end and the high end. But just think of it again, like if you put a polarity here and a polarity here, here's the one extreme, here's the other extreme of what you're describing. So what they're saying is there's a range of openness, a range of conscientiousness, a range of extroversion, a range of agreeableness, and you'll see with extroversion, then the range would be, really introversion over here. The introvert over here would be the recluse, the recluse, or quiet, or aloof, or this exaggerated sense of caution. And over here, the sociable, talkative, friendly. So somewhere in the middle is the median. And over here, it's just measuring by extroversion relative to extroversion, and so on, and so on. So it's fairly straightforward and not too difficult to apprehend. The big 5 personalities: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeable, and neuroticism. If you took any of those, where would you rate? Where would you rate on that? On the neuroticism, the ability to just become locked in and focused and fixated on something. You just can't let go of it. So on the one hand, are you a very self-pitying type of person. Way over here, the ultra emotional, self-pitying, extremely nervous kind of person, or over on the other side, the calm, secure, relaxed, self-satisfied, the content person. Person situated, person situation controversy. So we have Walter Miskell, and he is 1930 to 2018, and Robert Epstein, just born in 1953, so a few years older than I am, which is, by the way, really old. So here's Walter Miskell. He argued that situations and not personality traits determines a person's behavior. So it's an interesting thing to think about. What is the ideology? That is to say, the origin of certain behaviors. From where do they come? And is it just a foregone conclusion? Because here's your personality, this will be your behavior, or is it something about the situation that you're in? Given your personality, there needs to be a context in which that personality is placed, that in that context, certain behaviors will be produced. It's the word determine here that we struggle with a little bit, right? Because we certainly know that certain contexts and situations could induce certain behavior or tempt us to certain behavior. But to say it's automatically determined just because of our personality traits, yeah. So I guess that's why you have the word controversy there. So he pointed out situation dependence, the situation dependence of behavior. This is Miskell's thing. Epstein, on the other hand, Robert Epstein, he pointed out methodological research flaws, and he argued that accurate assessment of trait behavior relationship requires assessment over time and situations. And he posited that traits are general behavioral tendencies rather than behavioral predictors. So a much more modified point of view. He says, really, if you're going to come to that knee-jerk theory that it's your personality placed in a situation, foregone conclusion, this will be the outcome. So maybe we don't have enough information here to get Miskell right. But if that's the case, Epstein is saying, now you really have to study it out over. It's like body language. If you observe me over a period of time, I use these a lot, right? So I'm using my hands a lot. There's certain, my wife will say I have certain, I raise my eyebrows. I do all kinds of things, which may be a reason why I shouldn't get the camera too close when I'm preaching. Or maybe I should. But it's what I communicate that way. But see, you'd have to know me over time. And you could tell maybe when I'm disturbed about something, and I've been told so many times it's just almost impossible to read. And maybe that's true. It probably is true. But what Epstein is saying is before you come to these, kind of conclusions, how about, you test multiple populations, in multiple cultures and linguistic types of domains and all this type of thing, but over a period of time before you begin to take these types of conclusions. Major personality theoretical approaches. So through this in here, I got this out of Grigg, if I'm not getting ahead of Grigg's. So here's just a table in there, if I can move myself out of the way here. So here's a table, and you can see, and we've talked about these, right? We've talked about these. The psychoanalytic approach, that's the Freudian, Jungian, how do you say that with Adler's name? Adlerian. There we go, Adlerian. Karen Horney, remember? And then the humanistic, as far as Maslow and Rogers, social cognitive and trait. So you can see that there are a lot of variables given each of these theoretical approaches, and which can just make the study of personality somewhat interesting, I guess. So let's look at assessment just a bit. Primary uses of personality test and personality assessments. So the tests aid in diagnosing people with problems. So if you have the standardized test and you're saying that, well, if it's this particular personality, however that's labeled, let's say it's labeled this melancholy, choleric with choleric tendencies or something, but whatever that personality assessment reveals, then when that particular personality has some type of an issue that requires some type of talk therapy, let's say, that's the secular word for counseling. when you need talk therapy, or you're in a point of making certain decisions and whatever, maybe it can help in some way. Of course, understand that we're talking just merely in a secular sense. I mean, the Bible, here the Bible offers biblical truth that gives us true perception, right? Whether it's internal or external, self-perception or perception of others. So we have this as a guide, as a template. But from a psychological standpoint, if they're going to do talk therapy, then they're going to want to do a personality assessment. And then depending on whether they think your situation, your personality predetermines certain behavior in your situation, how are we going to be able to do a behavioral modification? How does that work relative to the situation that you're in? Is it something that is stable? Is it something that's global? All these types of things weigh in. So the personality test, there can be personality inventories by which you make those assessments. It's a questionnaire, basically an inventory. It's a questionnaire designed to reveal personality traits. And then what are called projective tests, or words, images, or situations. These are presented. The responses are analyzed for the, like the unconscious expression of elements of personality they reveal. So what is revealing in these types, and we'll see like a Rorschach test momentarily. There's the personality inventory is designed to measure multiple traits of personality, and I think we get this because we've talked about it enough. And one being the MMPI-2 Minnesota multiphasic personality inventory. That's the most widely used. It's a bunch of like true, false, or true, false, can't say. I've used in marriage counseling, that has nothing to do with a personality assessment, but I've used what's called a pair test, and it basically can be used for any two people in any kind of relationship, work relationship, but in this case, a marital relationship. It has 500 questions on it, and they're all just yes or no. I like peanut butter. That's a yes or no. There is no can't say, not sure. And then you take, and all those 500 questions are just all mixed up in all kinds of, it doesn't make sense. I like camping. This something, could be anything. And then you plot those things. You take a score, each column you take a score, and then you plot the results for him. You plot the results for her on 20. There's 20 different categories. So it really, what it measures is compatibility. It gives you a snapshot at that point in time, but only at that point in time, because people will change over time, especially in marriage. And so for couples that I've married, and I have that, like, okay, so that's you when you were dating. And this, I use this in pre-marriage. And then if you came back 5-10 years later and did it again, you'd see how there is a certain disparity, between maybe where he is plotted on some, and there's a standard deviation, between those two numbers that indicate compatibility. And also when you connect the dots, how they go like this, that indicates if they're going like this and all over. And so what does it do? It says, well, you're not compatible, so that's it. cancel the wedding plans. No, it's basically is to give a picture that the person during the dating time, some of this might be self-perception versus persona, right? Because the person really thinks they are this way may not be that they are in reality, or that during the dating period, they've just been showing some persona. This is who I want you to think I am, you know? And so I can remember one couple, and this was maybe 25 years ago. I married them. I think they've celebrated their 25th at this point. Yeah, so I can remember her specifically when I was going over the results with them, just so they knew ahead of time, you know, that, and one of them was like outdoors types of activities. And he says, I don't get it. Why are we so far apart? Why are we can't be incompatible. You love to go camping with me. You always have such a great time. And she sat there like, you know, like this. I hate it. I hate the bugs. I hate it. And he says, well, why didn't you say something? Because, you know, there's certain points in that relationship where you want the other person, you want to support them, and you want them to think that you maybe like that certain thing. And then that's all fine. You know, that's all fine to just finally get it out there and say, okay. So maybe there are times you do things that you personally dislike, but the other person should know that. They shouldn't know that you're just, you know, you're happy-go-lucky with it. But so there's a bunch of tests like this, you know, and the MMPI 1 or 2, as the case might be, true, false, cannot say, 567 simple statements. I like to cook, you know, you either do or you don't, something like that. Then we have projective test, sample tests like Rorschach, ink block tests. Wow, these things are really interesting, right? So you have these 10 symmetric ink blots. You could Google it. It'll show you what these are, and basically, you know, maybe even on the test give you a list of what do you think? Do any of these, and you know, if any of this makes any sense whatsoever. But really highly subjective, you know. So here, look at this, for example, and what do you see? Is there a correct answer to that? No, because what it is it, you know, you're then going to indicate, oh, this is what I see. And that somehow is revealing of an unconscious sort of aspect of your personality. You know, maybe every time they show you a different one of these Rorschach ink blots, you are saying every single thing that you say has a violent or hostile connotation to it, or maybe a very peaceful and withdrawn. You know, I see a butterfly, and somebody else might say, I see a arrowhead, you know, on a spear or something, right? And they say, oh, this is very, very revealing, like this. So there you have it. So thematic apperception tests, you know, 31 cards with black and white pictures of ambiguous settings and one blank card can also give us some indication of a particular personality, or what's called a TAT test. So there are certainly others that we could look at and go further into this, but we'll just hold off here and conclude it here on personality and personality assessment. I hope you guys have a great day, and Lord willing, we'll see you soon, other than by video. God bless you.